Welcome to our 2021 CJS Thursday lecture series. Thank you for coming today. My name is Mieko Yoshihama. I'm a professor in the School of Social Work here in University of Michigan. I have a couple general announcements before we start. Next Thursday, which is November 18th, we will have a lecture by Professor Adam Klulo at the University of Texas, Austin. And the lecture is titled, "The Massacre and the Conspiracy, Locating the Japanese Diaspora in the 17th Century Southeast Asia." I hope you can join us. For future programs, please check our website, CJS events/UM, I believe, or various social media. Your webcams and microphones have been muted, but we welcome you to submit your questions during the lecture using the Q&A function of the Zoom. And we will try to address your questions, as many as possible. So today, I'm delighted to introduce to you Professor Cécile Sakai, who is a professor of Japanese literature at the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilization, Paris Diderot University, formerly known as Paris 7, and which was merged with Paris 5, and now they are called Paris University. Professor Sakai served as the dean of the department from 2001 to 6, then as the vice president of student and cultural affairs of the university. And she has held many leadership positions at the department and the university. Between 2016 and 2019, Professor Sakai served as the director of the French Research Institute on Japan at Nichifutsu Kaikan, the Maison Franco-Japonais in Tokyo. Professor Sakai specializes in Japanese modern and contemporary literature, poetry, and translation and cultural transfers. As you can imagine, she has a long list of publications, both in the form of journal articles and edited books, mostly in French, but some in Japanese, such as Honyaku Tachi no Chousen, my not so good translation here, translators' challenges faced by or taken up by translators. You may be wondering why I, the professor of social work, is introducing Professor Sakai, who is an expert in literature. I first met Professor Sakai when I visited her university after the Great East Japan disaster of 2011. At the time, I was organizing an exhibition and a presentation at her university about women's experiences of that disaster. Professor Sakai and I, both of us are native of Japan. We have been profoundly affected by and incorporating the experience of the disaster into our professional and scholarly work. For Professor Sakai, an example is her co-editing a collection of essays and stories of the disaster. Professor Sakai also organized a symposium early this year entitled 10年後の 3.11 震災をどう描くか. English translation would be how to represent the catastrophe Japan 10 years after the Great East Japan disaster. Professor Sakai has also published over 30 translations of works by great authors, such as Kawabata Yasunari, Tanizaki Junichiro, and many others, including Kuma Kengo, very famous and my favorite architect. And Professor Sakai has received a prestigious Nichifutsu Honyaku Bungakusho, a Konishi French-Japanese Translation Prize, not only once, twice, for her translation of the work of Tanizaki Junichiro and the work of Enji Fumiko. So today, Professor Sakai will discuss challenges of Japanese contemporary literature, and her talk is entitled Japanese Contemporary Literature, Perspectives and Aporia in the Global 21st Century. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sakai. Sakai 先生、よろしくお願いします。Please.
はい。はい、皆様、こんにちは。Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Professor Yoshihama, for your very kind introduction. And I'm delighted to meet you today from Paris, across the seas, thanks to the magic of online, of course, and despite that horrible COVID pandemic, which limits our meetings. And I would like to start by thanking Professor Yoshihama herself for her very kind invitation, and the entire team of the Center for Japanese Studies at the University of Michigan, namely Barbara Kinsler and Robin Griffin, for their assistance, very precious assistance. Thank you very much. So do you hear me? There's no problem, just have to check that. Yes. So I'll share my screen for the PowerPoint. Just wait a moment, please. Can you see the screen? Is it okay? Thank you very much. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about a very broad topic in about 40 minutes of time. And I hope to answer to some of your questions at the end. Today's title is Japanese Contemporary Literature, Perspectives in the Aporia in the Global 21st Century. And I'll decline some this program that you see on this next slide with essentially 4 points. The question of Japan versus the world, the positioning of Japan in literature, in the world of literature. Then focus on Murakami Haruki as one of the very emblematic writers of the contemporary times. A second focus on another writer, which is very distinctive, who is Tawada Yoko, translation as The Trial of Otherness. And then I shall try to conclude with the reflection on the meaning of literature nowadays and the critical challenges that it suscites. So then, let us try first to be methodological and start with the famous question once asked by the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, which is, what is literature? Qu'est-ce que la littérature? Asking this question in 1948 and asking it today in 2021 cannot call for the same answers, obviously. The context has completely changed. Multiple definitions exist, but I would propose for my part to approach literature as a set of texts, narratives, and representations inscribed in art as an agency of written languages. It is commonly considered that the different artistic forms develop along more or less secular cycles. All literary histories, more or less evolutionary, including Franco Moretti's graphs, maps, and trees, show that the modern literary field was really constituted in Europe from the 19th century to the 20th century, with, from France, for instance, famous writers like Flaubert, Stendhal, Proust, Camus, for example. But of course, there are very important writers in Germany, in Great Britain, in Italy. among all others, of course. For the United States, we can see that the canonical figures are concentrated in the 20th century, with notably, for example, among others, Fitzgerald, Faulkner, Steinbeck, Hemingway, and later Pynchon, Irving, Ross, and so on. What about Japan? If we apply similar criteria, we find great names in the heart of the 20th century whose masterpieces are translated and that you may have read. For example, Natsume Soseki, Tanizaki Junichiro, perhaps the two Nobel Prize winners who are Kawabata Yasunari in 1968 or Oe Kenzaburo in 1994, or even Mishima Yukio, who is famous for other things. But today, the question is, what about this actuality of literature? We must recognize a generalized declinist appreciation. We do remember the controversies in history caused by Francis Fukuyama with The End of History and The Last Man, that was an essay published in 1992, and the criticism of endism, quote, according to Samuel Huntington. In the literary field, clearly in France, critics have been vying with pessimistic visions since the 2000s. And very recently, a famous philosopher like Alain Finkielkraut or a famous literary critic like Antoine Compagnon have just published in 2021 books on the after literature or on the end of literature. The same kind of approach can be found in Japan, the most striking criticism being undoubtedly that of Karatani Kojin, one of the most important thinkers in Japan, with his Kindai Bungaku no Owari, The End of Modern Literature, which was published in 2005. But one could quote many other titles, including by writers themselves, for example, in the self-depreciating but hyper-reflexive picture of Takahashi Genichiro, one of the contemporary writer, important contemporary writer, with this book, Nihon Bungaku Seisuishi. This one is the second one published in 2018. And you see the headline, which is Bungaku nante mou arimasen yo, which means that literature, it does not exist anymore. So this is quite provoking, and I shall try to answer to these interrogations. This is not without any reason that such a chorus rises after the fundamental and globalizing technological and cultural changes around the 2000s, especially the digital turn and the visual turn, which reduced the share of traditional writing and thus its circuit from production to reception. Surveys on reading times are significant everywhere and indicate a clear reduction of this practice. If we take the Japanese case, the editorial data collapse, and we can see with the table on the slide, you see between 1991 and 2015, the curve is constantly declining and very strongly declining. Here, as you see, the violet part concerns the magazines, the green part concerns the books. Another data is also interesting. This is data concerning the number of bookstores in Japan. And that is also very significant because it has decreased by half in the last 20 years. You see the number here which on the slide. Where we can understand, without necessarily sharing this pessimism, that an era is coming to an end, and the one that saw the construction of new literary fictionalities based on original principles, innovative themes and styles, developing close and varied links to reality and followed by a passionate readership. A canonical patrimony was thus constituted and seems to be over. We are now in another phase. For as much the contemporary literatures, those of the present time, continue to make their way, perhaps narrow, but all the more ambitious as they must fight the skepticism which accompanies any transition and found their future. We are thus in a transitional time. So the question will be the position of Japan in the world. It is precisely this contemporary literature of Japan, that of today, that I would like to evaluate with you, not as a national cultural entity within its physical and linguistic borders, but in its interactions with different aspects of the international scene. The work themselves are extremely hybrid now, as they are crossed from one side to the other by multiple influences. The sources and resources are global. Translation is, I think, the key word in this planetary fluidity. The sources in Japan, the language barrier is gradually giving way to the accumulation of translations. First of all, the Western works that have been widely translated into Japanese since the 1880s, but also progressively since the 1960s, about 1 century later, of the Japanese works that are translated into foreign languages. Gradually, translation flows must necessarily be considered as literary criteria. In the same vein, the notion of world literature, which was launched by David Damrosch in 2003, Princeton University Press, remains, I think, a defining paradigm of the 21st century criticism, even if it is controversial and subsequently discussed by other scholars, like in the United States, Emily Apter, New York University, with her, I quote, Against World Literature on the Politics of Untranslatability, published in 2013 by Verso, or in France by Barbara Cassin, who is an important philosopher who works with Emily Apter and who has published with her the English version of the Dictionary of Untranslatables, which was published also by Princeton University Press in 2014. These works mark the limit of a general and inclusive vision based on the dominance of the English language, without questioning the need to open up the scale of approaches, bringing stakeholders into dialogue, connecting translated works and translating languages, dominants and subalterns. As you know, this circular approach can be found today in the humanities and social sciences, in history, principally, with a very important theorist like Sanjay Subramanian, but you see also those circulation theories in anthropology or in sociology, and also in literature. Contemporary Japanese literature is thus no longer only a local or peripheral literature, even if it's not a global literature either, one that overhangs the world. We will dare to use the metaphor of local literature in the terms of sociologist Robertson and then Zygmunt Bauman, or more precisely of local/global literature, that is to say, one that currently mobilizes local resources in order to follow a trajectory of international legitimization. Before continuing, I would like to remind you that in any research, it is necessary to question, clarify the point of view of the observation. Of course, with this presentation, I am modestly contributing to this recognition of contemporary Japanese literature because I am personally convinced of its interest in itself and in the world as a deposit of remarkable works that it covers. Now, let us, in concrete terms, look at two contemporary authors of maturity, chosen because they best illustrate our problematic and who offer us contrasting case studies in relation to this legitimation dynamic. These are Murakami Haruki and Tawada Yoko, working along separate paths. So we shall first have a focus on Murakami Haruki and his shareable fictions translation as a dissemination tool. America will serve as a keyword to evoke the figure of Murakami, born in Kyoto and staying then in Kobe durably, born in 1949, who was graduated from Waseda University, the Department of English American, and aptly the most translated modern writer, over 50 languages now, and best known Japanese author in the world, including in China, for example, nominated several times for a third, or maybe third, Nobel Prize in Japanese literature. Today, in France, 22 titles can be read, with the record set in 2006, which saw the publication of the French translation of Kafka on the Shore, in Japanese, Umibe no Kafka, which was published first in Japan in 2003, which sold in France more than 70,000 copies in 3 months, which was a real record. And you see, having in France 22 titles in French is very, very important. He is not the only writer who has so many translations in French. Curiously, and a woman writer, who is very interesting, and unfortunately, I don't have the time to focus on her, whose name is Ogawa Yoko, that maybe you have read some of her novels, is also very much translated in French, into French. But these are really record-making writers. So according to a recent survey of the newspaper Asahi, Murakami is also recognized by the readers, Japanese readers, interviews, as the most important author of the Heisei period, the last 30 years. America plays a major role in the writer's life and work. He published his first novel in 1979 at the age of 30. His first novel, entitled Listen to the Song of the Wind, Kaze no uta o kike in Japanese. And 2 years later, in 1981, he published his first translation from American great novel, that is The Lost City by Scott Fitzgerald. Since then, Murakami has alternated between creative work and translation, and today he has more than 70 translations and retranslations of the 20th century American literature. Fitzgerald, of course, but also Raymond Carver, with the complete work of Raymond Carver, which is quite incredible. Also John Irving, Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, Truman Capote, and so on. The list is very, very long. We can take the case of Salinger. Salinger's, the famous Catcher in the Rye that you must have read, of course, when you were young before, which was translated 3 times already in Japan, and Murakami published the 4th translation as a masterpiece. For the cover that you see here, he chooses to keep the original grand title, The Catcher in the Rye, here making a paratext that relies on the conjunction between the fame of the work and the fame of the translator, Murakami Haruki. The name is namely pushed in front of the headline, of course. And in so, he reintroduces in the translation the heterogeneity of the English work, of course, at the very heart of the translation. Until the 2000s, Murakami was quite discreet about his practice, and some of the readers did not ever know that he was also a translator. But since then, he has begun to tell us a lot of things about his practice as a translator. And it is important to emphasize that here, that it is not a question of translating the whole, but translating the American literature. This is very significant from the historical point of view, but also from the ideological point of view, given the domination of the American model in the second half of the 20th century in Japan. And it is obvious that the closest proximity to this model legitimates Murakami's work. In a way, writing in English can gain global recognition. We can better understand the author's recent performances that I shall quote very quickly. With, for example, this book, which name is Murakami Haruki, Hybriddo in Japanese. Hybriddo is a suitcase word composed of hybrid and literature, and is a collection of 3 short stories in bilingual English and Japanese by Tim O'Brien, Raymond Carver, and Haruki Murakami, as you see. What interests us here is that Murakami's short story is called Lederhosen. It's a German word which designs Bavarian leather pants. And the plot itself is very global, linking USA, Germany, and Japan. Above all, the notice explains that there are 3 versions of the original in Japanese of the original text. The original, absolutely original text has been published in 1985 in Japan. Then it was translated into English by one of the most important translators, Alfred Birnbaum, in 1992 for the famous English literary magazine Granta, 1992. And finally, and that's the neck of the story, well, has been retranslated from that English version to the Japanese version by Murakami Haruki himself, from the English version for a republication which occurred in 2005 and which participates to the anthology The Elephant Disappears, Zo no Shoumetsu, which was published in 2005. We fall here in a real labyrinth of translations with 3 versions which compete here: the notion of text, author, and original reader, all inscribed in the bias of the uniqueness of the world, give way to a kind of continuum necessarily inducing new critical approaches. I have to accelerate my presentation, so I shall just evoke for the slides what happened for Murakami Haruki. Since 2014, the NHK National Channel Publishing House has launched a series of English language publications of Murakami's main short stories aimed at a Japanese audience and aimed at a didactic purpose to learn English. So in a way, these series offer to Japanese readers the possibility to learn English, not through English American works, but through the translations into English of a Japanese national author. So this is also a very interesting case. In other words, the mimetic strategy is really working. And to complete the picture, we can add that the work of the translator Murakami Haruki is republished by Chuoko Nonsha with already 27 volumes which are published in Japan. We can cite, quote, and many other examples, of course, just quote the titles of works like Kafka on the Shore or 1Q84, an obvious homage to George Orwell, of course, or a recent short story which has been adapted to a movie. I think it's also distributed in the United States, which title is Drive My Car, original title in katakana, Drive My Car, which is in the anthology Men Without Women, which was published in Japan in 2014. And this movie, interesting movie lasting 3 hours, won the Screenplay Award in Cannes Film Festival, filmed by Hamaguchi Ryusuke. And it's very complicated because it includes Chekhov's play Uncle Vanya in a kind of casing device, and the film amplifies the structure with an international distribution, an international casting. A recent study provides some keys to explain the exceptional success of Murakami Haruki. I don't have the time to enter in the details, but the book has been written by Karashima David, and it is confirmed by another book, this one, Shokugyo Toshite no Shousetsuka, in English translation, Novelist as a Profession, not yet translated officially into English, but which was published in French in 2019, as you see, Profession Romancier. In that book, Murakami clearly confirms this voluntary strategy of global legitimation, and it has gained an extreme effectiveness because we must remember once again that Murakami's works is also extremely popular in Asia, not only in Taiwan, but also in PRC, in Korea, in Thailand, and Southeast Asia also. And so we have a real monument, international monument, which has been constructed by Murakami himself. Yet the work manages to escape here and there from its formatting. A profound break occurred in 1995, the double shock of the Kobe earthquake in January, with 6,500 dead victims, and the sarin gas attack in the Tokyo subway by the pseudo-Buddhist sect Aum in March 1995, also with 13 dead victims and 6,000 people wounded. This upset his vision of the world. Murakami Haruki reflects on his responsibility as a writer around the idea of commitment coming after detachment, which must be more confronted with social and historical problems. In fact, in the following years, he published 2 collections of interviews about the attack of the victims of the subway attack under the title of Underground. And he also engages in the reconstruction of Kobe, the city where he lived in his youth, while transfiguring the question of trauma in the collection published in 2000 after the quake, in which he tells of tiny and disrupted lives full of monsters coming from the abyss. The major events of the Second World War, such as the Nanking Massacre, for example, will be mentioned more and more frequently in various ways in Murakami's later novels. Murakami explains that he wanted to describe a kind of absolute violence, arushi no attōteki na boruku, that he had never experienced before, and that literature serves to express and to notch more strongly the memory of generations in the making of a common history. It is perhaps in this spirit of a bet on a posterity that is not only individual but simply literary that Murakami Haruki recently bequeathed his entire archives to his university to create the Waseda International House of Literature, Haruki Murakami Library, which has just opened its doors in October. You can access to it via internet and connect to various interviews of the author and other specialists. We shall now focus on the second writer who interests us, Tawada Yoko, with her experimental topics, translations at the trial of otherness. As a second emblematic example, she is much less popular, but not less interesting. Tawada Yoko was born in 1916 in Tokyo, a decade after Murakami. She also graduated from Waseda University, so we see Waseda University as a kind of core of the contemporary literature, of course, not in English American, but in Russian. Then she went to Europe, graduated from the master course in Hamburg in Germany, and then from the PhD course in Zurich in German Switzerland. Settled then in Germany, she published her first works in the 1990s in both German and Japanese, which is an astonishing phenomenon, obtaining almost immediate critical recognition in both languages, winning the Akutagawa Prize in 1993 for a strange short story inspired by the Japanese folklore, which title is The Bridge Groom Was a Dog, Inumuko Iri. It's of course translated into English, and subsequently many Japanese literary prizes that I cannot enumerate, so many there are. And at the same time, a winner in Germany of the Chamisso Prize in 1996, the Goethe Prize in 2005, and recently in 2016, the Kleist Prize, the most important prizes for literature in Germany. Her works in France are mainly translated from German by through publishing house Verdier, and the number of publications remains very limited. You see 6 titles from German, 2 titles from Japan. But in the United States, for example, translations from German by Susan Bernowski alternate with translations from Japanese by Margaret Mitsutani in the same publishing house, which name you know, I'm sure that you know it, is New Direction Publishing. It goes without saying that this is a unique itinerary in contemporary literature, because the author is split and her 2 works develop in parallel, sometimes crossing each other when there are translations or exceptionally self-translations. Her case is reminiscent of Nabokov or Beckett, a very important author of the 20th century, but Tawada's case is absolutely unique because of the linguistic cultural unique coupling. At the same time, Tawada belongs to this new post-feminist female generation, which I call the heroes of feminist struggles. They have all a very high university training. They are reflexive. They have experimental approaches and a very assured enunciation for which male domination seems to no longer matter at all. Here again, we should take about some key moments on her creation. Thus, the inaugural work is written in German and is entitled Das Bad, so Le Bain. And I'll show you the book also, I have it here. So this was published first in 1989 in Tübingen, and it was written in German. But we shall learn with a republication, which occurred 20 years later, that the original of that book was originally written in Japanese with the title, with an entire different title, which is Urokomochi. And I just changed the version of the book. The same book on the other side is named Urokomochi, which means she who has scales. The preface in Japanese tells us that the concealment of the original in Japanese is due just to the hazard combination of circumstances which the author insisted to preserve because she found it, I quote, funny to provoke from an unpublished original quantities of translations in other languages. This is, of course, a very singular beginning for an author. Moreover, the book itself is an experimental masterpiece, both in terms of its content, which is a literary piece of literature of the absurd, a kind of black version of The Little Mermaid, and its form. Instead of a parallel presentation in front, in vis-a-vis of each other, the book must be handled from the left for the German version, this one, and from the right for the Japanese version, of course. And there is absolutely not any vis-a-vis for the translation, except in the exact middle of the page, of the work, sorry, page 19. I'll show you the only page where you can read the translation as a vis-a-vis, which is absolutely in the middle of that book. Of course, it's a kind of exploit, kind of pure experiment, but the core of the novel appears in a double ambivalent value, one as a sublimation of translation, because it is absolutely exceptional, but on the other side, as a deconstruction of translation, revealed by the cleaving structure of this work en tant que tel. Thereafter, Tawada continues to write in German, in Japanese. Sometimes the creation diverge, sometimes they converge, sometimes she rarely translates herself from German but into Japanese, but it happens. I shall just sorry, that was the page. So, and just wait a moment. You see, sorry. Do you see my PowerPoint? Sorry. Is it okay? Okay. So there are many other experiments, but I'm looking at at the clock, and I see that I don't have the time to enter in all the details.
Actually, you're doing good with time, so take your time to explain, please.
Okay, thank you. Just wait a moment. I have to take up. Okay. So she also translates herself from time to time, and it's always from from German, her acquired language, into Japanese, which is her mother tongue, of course, in itself. But she plays always with words, and that's the case for a work she has translated from German, to Japanese, which is a novel which was published in 2008, first written in German under the title Schwager in Bordeaux, which means my brother in Bordeaux. Then she translated herself into Japanese under the title you see here, Bordeaux no Gike, brother-in-law in Bordeaux. And the novel is composed, as you see, and this is the cover page, by unusual kanji, unusual graphic themes, which are reversed or inversed, mirrored, and which, of course, present obstacles for the reading in itself. And in the same way, the German versions, the French versions, include those strange characters which are for German or French readers absolutely unreadable, of course. So this is also a kind of ludic approach that Tawada develops through her works. And this is a writing game, of course, that acts as a cryptography, an obstacle to accessibility. Translation is not dissemination here, but on the contrary, a place of tensions, a place of confrontations with otherness. And in this sense, one can interpret Tawada's position as being eminently attentive to otherness, to the playful friction between local and local, yet another pattern in relation to the local-glocal pattern that I have mentioned in the beginning of my presentation. In any case, Tawada continues her experiment in literature, and in 2011, the very year, we must say, of the Great Japan disaster, she publishes Yukino Denshusei, in Japanese first, The Snow Student, a novel that stages the family, political, and fabulous saga of a little polar bear who is in reality none other than Knut, then the real mascot of the Berlin Zoo. The novel brought her success and literary prizes. Then Tawada tried for the first time a new and risky experiment, that is to translate into German the acquired language, her novel published first in Japanese. And this German version is also the author's original version, so that the other translations into European languages, into English, into French, and so on, will come from the German version, although the real original version of that work is a Japanese version. This version in America earned to her translator, Susan Berkowski, in 2016, the Warwick Prize for Women in Translation under the New Directions Publishing house. But translations from Japanese are also receiving American recognition. So, sorry, this is the German version, original version by Yoko Tawada. This is the French version from the German version. This is the American version coming from the German version. And then the next topic, translation from Japanese are also receiving American recognition. That's the case in 2018, by this time, the emissary, translated from the Japanese, Kentoshi in Japanese. So I'll show you the cover, the emissary, and you see on the top right place that it has earned the National Book Award prize. I'll come back to this question. This Kentoshi, the emissary, is a post-disaster dystopia, clearly pointing to a Japan that has become unlivable because it has become nuclearized. It is a new world in which the elderly never die, while children, extremely fragile, are doomed to disappear. The grandfather and his grandson experienced this very painfully. Now, this novella has received the prestigious American National Book Award for Translated Literature in 2018, as I said, in a great translation by Margaret Mistani. I quote one of the many striking passages in this story, referring for the translation of Margaret Mistani, of course. And I must say that the French translation is due to come next spring, 2022, by the same publishing house, Verdier en tant que tel. So this is in the slide, just a part of this work that I would like you to read. I just read it in English. You can see the Japanese here. 9/10 of the children lived with a mild fever. So did Mume. The school management had forbidden any measurement to avoid that a daily control makes the children too nervous. Yoshiro, accompanied by his great-grandson, went to bury the thermometer in the cemetery of objects. It was a public place where everyone could part with precious things and bury them. Yoshiro had already buried a novel there, the end of which he had not managed to write. So this is just a small extract of this very interesting novel, which is really inspired by the great Japan disaster of 2011. Tawada's works appears as exemplary because she has integrated in various ways the ruptures induced by the triple catastrophe of March 11, 2011. This is a kind of ontological rupture, a kind of dislocation of the meaning given to the literary work, of the link between literature and society, of the always possible reversal of the scale of values. Tawada's literary scene is, as you see, discontinuous because it unfolds in two local languages, German and Japanese. And the translations into multiple languages of the world are issued either from German, either from Japanese, in a double circulation of works, which is compose networks and end up meeting and forming knots, as in the theory of network. For this double American and recent recognition, we can recognize here a nod, an encounter between two heterogeneous circuits that cross here, as in a geometric diagram. The exploration continues, and we can think that we can suppose that the importance of this work will continue to amplify through this kind of amplification, which is absolutely not using translation as a dissemination tool. So I'll get to the conclusion slowly but quickly. In a period of transition, critical judgment does not have sufficiently reliable elements to be able to evaluate the full significance of a phenomenon on a historical level. One can use with caution the common tool of analogy, it looks like, that is to say, compare, to try to define one's object a little bit better, and to critically rely on images that can contribute to our intelligibility. As well in Murakami as in Tawada, with very contrasted trajectories, we notice a literary appropriation of the catastrophe, generic term gathering here all the major ruptures, dislocations, events, and socials. In different terms, they express through their text and their discourses the responsibility of the writer to develop the critical glance, to create the distance of representation, without which the immediacy and the power of the facts are coming to swallow the human being, the victim in the broad sense, in a definitive nonsense. This position is that of the construction of a literary memory of humanity. Never forget, you should never forget. It is 1995, it is 2011 in Japan. It is undoubtedly today the world health crisis that we know, which reinforce it while making more fragile our beliefs and illusions. We remember, and I shall shift to another big past for us all, which is, of course, the Second World War with Theodor Adorno, famous German philosopher, his famous sentence that I quote, "Writing a poem after Auschwitz is barbaric." He wrote that in 1949, a sentence he later disavowed, I must say. Transferring this thought to the Japanese scene, Japan's leading scholar of post-catastrophe literature, Kimura Saiko, who is professor at Tsudajuku University, many of whose articles are translated into English already, writes in her recent book entitled The Post-Theory of Post-Catastrophe Literature, その後の震災文学論, その後の震災後文学論, sorry, which was published by Seidosha in 2018. I quote Kimura Saiko, "It is not just novels or films that deal with the Northeast Japan disaster, but the very existence of this literature that shakes a rigid reading system and puts pressure on criticism as it has been constructed until now. In other words, it is all Japanese literature of the post-catastrophe period that it's concerned. Any work read after this event is necessarily interpreted as inscribed in the memory of the catastrophe." These are very strong phrases. Any work read after this event is necessarily interpreted in the memory of the catastrophe. Here I will quote also a French specialist, Catherine Cocchio, with the idea of a literature in suspension, a formula borrowed from the Hungarian writer Imre Kertész, who is an Auschwitz survivor and Nobel Prize of Literature 2002, to qualify the narrative rupture, the loss of reference points, and the apparent impossibility to continue to go on, induced by the absolute violence, the absolute Nazi violence. But Catherine Cocchio, in her book, will write the following things. I quote her: "The setting in suspension, of which speaks Kertész, is a setting in crisis or in doubt of the literature, of its relevance, of its contents, of its heritage. By the passage by the doubt, which is also the condition of the continuation, or its revival is henceforth constitutive to it. So the passage by the doubt is constitutive of the renewal of the literature. This is also, I think, a very strong statement. And between international recognition, the horizon of expectation for the works of Murakami, Tawada, and some others, Japanese writers, and the fundamental test of literary legitimacy in the face of violent regime ruptures, Japanese literature could thus access to a kind of, I think, universalizing double legitimacy. One hand through the translations, on the other hand, by the link to the most important tragedies of the humanity for the first time in its history. Indeed, in Japan, since 2011, a number of works in prose, poetry, or drama deal formally or implicitly with the disaster. Some of them have received the CRCAO Prize, central on the literary scene. We note that a decade later, very recently, in July 2021, Ishizawa Mai has won the CRCAO Prize with a short story's title is Kai ni tsuzuku basho ni ite. I'm sorry, the slide is not very clear. So it's Kai ni tsuzuku basho ni ite, where it follows the shell, a very intriguing title. It tells about a female narrator who lives abroad, namely in Göttingen in Germany, in the middle of a massive health crisis, impossibility to move, where she meets, nevertheless, there a friend, an old friend, who is supposed to be missing in Fukushima. It's a very mysterious short story, halfway between the world of the dead and the world of the living, anchored in a German-Japanese universe that recalls, of course, Tawada's world, as if this literary network continued through new authors. And I have to remind that Ishizawa Mai, who lives in Germany, was born in 1980. That means 2 decades after Tawada Yoko. And I get to my real conclusion now. Between global and local dynamics, Japanese writers continue to search for their raison d'être. This is an essential motivation to read and reread them. And we can also witness movements in the field of literary critics beyond gender studies, post-colonial studies, and cultural studies. Beyond, that means ecology with eco-criticism, of course, disaster with disaster studies, common good with studies on the common good in literature, intervention with studies on literature in situation, and so on. All those recent trends seem to return to a kind of committed literature of the new age, but transformed by its own questioning, by the doubt that I quote before, and which was presented by Catherine Cocchio. I think that we are facing a new momentum, a new impulsion is expected to develop critical approaches that accompany these dynamics. I'll say that to finish, we'll try our best. And I thank you for your attention. Merci de votre écoute and goseijo. Arigatou gozaimashita. So I think, well, I have spoken about 1 hour. It's a bit too long, sorry.
No, because we didn't start until say 10, 15 minutes later. So you're perfect. Thank you very much. I am sure the audience has enjoyed this very thought-provoking talk. I myself must confess that I have a new appreciation, new insight of the very famous and popular authors, but I am having a different light insight. So thank you very much. I'm stunned. I am speechless. Really,
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Interest, very, very, fascinating. I'd like to invite the audience to pose a question, either in English, Japanese, or maybe French. If you want to practice your French, please do.
I'm ready to try to answer. I'm sorry for my English, which is not absolutely perfect, but I did my best as a French-speaking and Japanese-speaking scholar.
Yeah, you did fine, fantastic.
No.
No question from the audience. Panelists, would you like to pose a question, or shall I pose a question? This might be I wonder, you pose an issue, this local, global, or some people may call it glocal, right? But by listening to your talk, there's more than just local and global, right? That's I think your thesis. Could you tell us a little bit more on what you have been thinking about?
Of course. The term glocal is quite now in use, and you see that word in various kind of papers here and there, of course. And as you know, it is used for the localization strategies. For example, one of the very common example, which is quoted generally, is the McDonald's strategy. You have that in everywhere in the world, but you'll have some hamburgers will not have the same taste and not have the same contents from country to another. Even big other marks like Coca-Cola will not have the exact same recipe from country for country, and that was named global things which will adapt to a local thing in order to be for a better penetration of the market. And what I wanted to tell about literature was that the movement could be on the opposite side. I mean, the local things will try to get to an international step through, of course, the translation tool. But as we saw, there are different paths to do that. And in that way, I preferred not to use the term glocal like that, but to inverse. And that's why I talk about the local glocal, or local glocal, if I may say so,
yeah. See,
on the other movement.
Yeah, that makes sense. And as you articulated, there are different approaches to from local to global, and some authors took it upon themselves to do it in a very creative ways. What about you? May I ask how you navigate, originally from Japan, educated and working in France, right? And you navigate between French literature, Japanese, and what about you? How you do this?
Well, it's a very good question, Yoshihama Sensei, because in the beginning of my lecture, I told you that it's very important to know exactly from which position we are speaking. Of course, this is for all scholars an obligation. And I told you that, of course, it's because I believe that there are very interesting things in literature, in Japanese literature, that I try to conduct researches on it, of course. But behind that, there is the position of each individual. So you were asking me my own private position, of course, about that.
Yes, well, as much as you feel comfortable. Tell us.
Yeah, no, well, no, I'm just thinking and speaking in the same time. So I hope it will be clear anyway. I was born in Japan, but as you know, my mother is French, my father is Japanese. So I'm coming from a hybrid context anyway. So that is something I have in my formation and in my personal life, private life from the beginning. This is, I think, a chance, of course, that I try to give this kind of double expertise to the level of the researches and the pedagogical teaching, of course, and having literature, beginning with Japanese literature that I had to work on very hardly, because of course there are so many beautiful and important works. You really have to, for example, to really be able to analyze contemporary works, you really have also to work on modern literature of the 20th century, and if possible to classical literature also, because there is also a historical continuum of all of this. So my first years of specialization were really completely concentrated on this kind of appropriation of the Japanese corpus. And this is in itself a very important task. But effectively, coming to the end of my kind of research turn, I'm now really interested by the interactions between those ensembles, national ensembles, between them, and the position and interactions of Japanese literature facing the other literatures. Those movements and circulative movements seem to me very interesting and up to date in a way, adapted to the 21st century problematics, which have really changed a lot for those last 20 years, let's say, 20 to 30 years. So it's very interesting to be born in the 20th century. I'm really a people of the 20th century.
昭和の女ですからって。
そうですね。
Yeah, we are about the
Exactly.
same age, so yes.
Yeah.
I,
sorry, but I think we have the duty to face 21st century, and this duty is expressed by one of the expression is this fluidity between those national monuments we have here and there, I think. Sorry.
ありがとうございました。Thank you. I have a question from a panelist, if I could read this question. I'm curious to know if you have any upcoming project, translations or research project that you can share with us.
Thank you very much. Well, I have a lot of projects. One of the trends consists in the orientation for retranslations. So as you have presented me kindly in the beginning, I have translated quite a lot of works, but there's a lot of masterpieces of the 20th century, which have been translated in the 1960s, 1970s, and it's the same preoccupation for me. We are now in 2021. We are in we are facing the middle of the 21st century, and it is largely the time to retranslate all the things, because the paradigms of translations have changed a lot. So there will be some important thing, and my ambition would be to take 2 or 3 years of my life to retranslate a masterpiece by Kawabata, who is one of my, and this masterpiece is Yukiguni, so this is Snow Country, which has been translated in the United States by Silent Sticker, and I think I know that it's considered in the United States as a very good translation, but controversial. But nobody, as I have heard, has for the moment tried to challenge that.
Wow! So
I think it's time to challenge that. And for France, it's the same thing. It's an old translation of the 1960s, and it's really necessary to give back to Kawabata, another, approach, another glance, another possibility to reach new readers by the renewal of the translation. So that's one of the things.
Yeah, big challenge, exciting.
Big challenge, yes.
So I have a question from the audience. I am going to read a question.
Okay.
So thank you so much for this amazing lecture. And I am a PhD candidate from the UK. And my research focuses on translingualism in transnational works by American-born Ekkyo Bungaku authors. Yeah. Levi Hideo sensei and Mizumura Minae sensei, in comparison to works by American authors of Japanese heritage. In the last 10 years, Levi sensei's debut novel, Seijouki no Kikoenai Heya, and Mizuna sensei's bilingual novel, Shishosetsu, from left to right, have both been translated from Japanese into English. So this audience asks, I'm curious to know whether you believe that it is possible a new interest in border-crossing Japanese literature is rising in the US or elsewhere in the world.
Very good question. Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I think our 21st century that we share really now is a border crossing century. And of course, unfortunately, the COVID pandemic has for 2 years now, almost 2 years now, completely stopped our movements in general. And I don't mean by that the former world was really better. I think it's also the time to reflect on this kind of ultra mobility, for example, that liquid society, that Zygmunt Bauman has analyzed very well, which was perhaps too much liquid in a way. So this kind of things. But you have, of course, the bridges in different various kinds of artistic expressions, and you have that also in literature, of course. So the transborder literatures, I think that they will continue very strongly in the coming years. You have so Levi Hideo and Mizumura Minae, of course, who are very famous and important for having, but they are quite different. Levi Hideo, he is American and he has adopted Japanese language. Mizumura Minae is a kind of the opposite case, because she's Japanese and she has adopted for mixed novels like Shishosetsu from left to right, the both languages inside her work in themselves. So these are very distinctive and interesting but complementary cases, I think. But you have also all the Asian transborder literatures, which are now currently being recognized strongly with the literary prizes, for example. I think that the same year, this year, in July 2021, Lee Kotomi, who is a Taiwanese writer, has also won the Akutagawa Prize. So that's very interesting. And she writes in Japanese, and the etiquette that we see in critical papers on her work is that she is a kind of Creole writer in Japanese. So Creolity, as you know, of course, with the ancient colonial empires and so on, you have really effectively some common points on which we can reflect on. And if we look over the history of modern literature since the end of the 19th century, in fact, there are quite a number of Korean and Chinese writers who were obliged to write in Japanese. And this is also a kind of transborder, transnational literature. And there are some researches which are actually conducted on those kind of literatures. So I think that in different areas, the researchers are developing very much, and this reflects also the movements which are created in the actual current literature in Japan.
Thank you. I could see how excited you are talking about this. Yes, we can go on and on all night.
Exactly.
I wonder, during your talk, you mentioned another author, if I remember, Ogawa Yoko?
Yes.
Yeah, would you like to tell us a little bit more about her?
Of course, yes. So, in a word, I would say that there is a kind of encounter, a magical encounter between Tawada Yoko's work and the French readership, which occurred about 30 years before. So it's something continuous and very interesting. In result, it's in French language that Ogawa Yoko is translated the more compared to all other languages. Mm-hmm. And the number of works, there are, of course, a number of factors which explain that, but she has already about 30 titles translated into French, which is absolutely incredible. I think that in English, it's about 10, something like that. Mm-hmm. So she is one of the important female writers, mm-hmm. More or less of the same generation, Tawada, Yoko, Kawakami Hiromi, and others, whom I call the heirs of the feminist struggles they had before them. Mm-hmm. Also very interesting authors before this generation. And this generation succeeded in taking, in a way, the symbolical cultural power to express themselves, let's say, perfectly and completely. And that's the case of Ogawa Yoko, with some bestsellers like Hakase no Aishita Sushiki. I don't know, I'm sure it's translated in French, but La formule préférée du professeur, it's in the translation in French, of course. So some of her novels are anchored in the everyday life with something like melancholia, nostalgia, and doubt facing this everyday life. Some other novels are really struggling with the idea of fantastic hidden behind the ordinary life, concerning ordinary life of, for example, women living at home, women who are mothers just, and who will suddenly discover a kind of, new dimension that they will travel around through before coming back to their first position. So this kind of psychological travels that Ogawa Yoko proposes, I think that they fit to the French readership attent. And that is one of the reasons why it works very well in France, considering, of course, that the point of view in almost all Ogawa Yoko's work is a feminine point of view. I mean that the protagonists are, for almost all of them, not all, because sometimes it's very interesting. She tries to have a male protagonist, but in general, it's a female protagonist with a kind of, system of projection and immersion, which is offered to the readers, who are, for most of them, women readers.
Yeah. Yes. As a feminist, very interested, and we can go on. Maybe you can come back and talk about that angle. We have another question, and you can read on the screen as well, but I will read for the audience. In the 2005 A New History of German Literature, edited by David Welbery, Tawada Yoko is only mentioned once in 1,000 pages critical analysis. While mentioning she's an award-winning writer, Tawada is described as simply plumbing the mysteries of language with zero critical analysis. Does her lack of critical reception within the new German canon represent simply a lack of understanding in German academia, or a profound schism that can be easily placed within German literature movement? Another big question.
Yes, very interesting and very challenging question, because I don't know very well what's happening in the German scene. I mean, I have some colleagues, of course, who are specialists of Japanese modern literature, and I discuss with them. But I didn't know that book, so I will ask her. I will ask them their opinion about that. You in the question, it is indicated that it's in 2005.
Yes,
that's right.
Mm-hmm.
So more than 15 years before. I think things have quite a lot changed, and I suppose, but it's a hypothesis, that this book is a very academic, old style book, I think. Why do I say that? Because in Germany, but also in France now, everybody challenges what they call German speaking literature or German language literature, as you have Nihongo Bungaku, and not anymore Nihon Bungaku, as you know, since Numa no Mitsuyoshi and these people. So that means that the language used is the most important. And in that case, of course, Tawada Yoko participates for half of her work, but half very important. I mean, also as important as 100% German writers, for example, into this literature. And in Paris at Sorbonne University, which is the most, let's say, ancient and traditional university. Even in that university, since now 10 years, there is a special post entitled German Language Literature, and the professor in post there is one of the most important translators of Tawada Yoko's work in, of course, German. And he writes a lot of papers on, for example, Turkish origin or Turkish born writers, who some of them are very important and have owned very important prizes, literary prizes in Germany. So I think it's a hypothesis, and I shall confirm that with my friends, colleagues. But I think that it's a kind of stone coming from the 20th century, that book.
Thank you very much. So unfortunately, our time is up. But thank you so much for this very inspiring, stimulating talk. I'm still kind of regurgitating some of the keywords you have used today: rapture, otherness, othering, distancing, presentation, representation, catastrophe, tragedy, memory, literature, possibilities, and challenges. And thank you again. I don't think I'm the only one who wish that you will come back to University of Michigan and give additional and different talks. Thank you again. And thank you, audience, for being a great listener. And I hope that you will join another noon lecture, not noon lecture, the Thursday lectures, now we call it. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all, and see you again, I hope.